Okay, I hope it works now. So to recap, I just want to do three things, basically. I'm not sure whether everybody is familiar with the situation in the Netherlands, so I want to give you a bit of a background in what the different groups are, where they are positioned in society, and so on, educationally and in terms of labor market. Then I want to tell you a little bit about attitudes that native Dutch have towards these immigrant groups, and then I want to tell you a little bit about research that we did about how Turkish immigrants react to that, and especially the question which is hotly debated in not only the Netherlands but also in Germany, the UK and other countries, whether these immigrants also develop a sense of national belonging, host national belonging, because it's increasingly considered important that these immigrants also develop a sort of loyalty and sense of belonging to the nation that they live in. So that's, please feel free to interrupt when something isn't clear, because I'm not sure what you're all familiar with or not. Some statistics to give you an idea what the situation is in the Netherlands. There is a country about 16.6 million people, right? And there are some 378,000 people of Turkish background, so that means 2.3% of the population. Actually, they are the largest immigrant group in the Netherlands in terms of numbers. The second one is the Moroccans, a little bit low. Then we have the Surinamese and the Antillians. These groups, of course, differ. They differ in their migration history. Turkish and Moroccan people have, of course, a history of labor migration. The first groups came in the end of the 60s, and then later by family reunification, the groups became larger. The other groups, Surinamese and Antillians, they have a colonial relationship to the Netherlands. So they came for different reasons. The Surinamese especially came after 1973, when Suriname became an independent state. And a lot of Surinamese people thought, well, we have to take the opportunity now to go to the Netherlands before it's too late and we can't anymore. And then there are also many other groups, refugees of Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Somalia, and, well, you name it. So in general, it's not that many. The population is not that high, you would say. In total, it's something about 10% of the population have an immigrant background, so 1.6 million, something like that. But of course, it differs a lot of the region where you are. In some cities, especially the big cities, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and in some neighborhoods, the percentages are, of course, much higher, right? So it depends a bit. This is countrywide, but it's not spread over the whole, equally over the whole country. It differs quite a lot where you are. There are neighborhoods in the big cities which the immigrant population will be about 70 or 80%. There are schools, primary schools, where the immigrant population will be around 90%. So there's quite a difference in where people are living and located. What's the social position? A couple of statistics, if you like. The school dropout is for these different immigrant groups. A school dropout in adolescence, you see that's a bit higher. It's not that tremendously high, but it's higher than for the native Dutch. So the native Dutch is about 1.3. Educational level 4, that's more or less the highest educational level that you can get. Well, you see that 1 in 3 of these minority groups, adolescents, get a relatively high education, whereas for the native Dutch, it's about 1 in 2. So in terms of educational position, you would see that they're lagging behind. Language deficit, that's also something which is, people are very concerned about. This is at the age of 12. So what people found in recent research is, especially for the Turkish group, children of 12 have the language capacities of a Dutch child of 10. So they're lagging behind some 2 years in language abilities. For the Moroccans, it's a little bit less, and of course the Surinamese and Antilleans, it's very low because they had a colonial history. They talked already Dutch in Suriname and Antillean. So there it's much less. So these are some of the statistics where you see that the social position is, especially compared to the native Dutch, more problematic, if you like. Another important indicator is unemployment. Well, compared again to the native Dutch, where you see about 4%, this was 2009, they collected these national data. You see that the unemployment among the different immigrant groups is much higher, and it's all a little bit similar. And it's not only about for the whole population, the adult population, but also youth employment. Youth employment is in general higher, as you see. Also for the native Dutch is quite higher, but you see that's almost twice as high for the Turkish, Moroccan, Surinamese, and Antilleans compared to the native Dutch. So also in not only in terms of education and educational level and language, but also in terms of unemployment, there is some, well, problems, if you like, or some groups are lagging behind, if you want. Another thing which is worrying people, especially policymakers and politicians, the idea is to have an integrated society where people meet each other and have relationships with each other. Things that people worried about is this, for instance, in leisure time, in free time, whether people have predominantly contact with members of their own group, so very much focused on their own group, or whether they also meet members of other groups. Well, you see that, especially for the Turkish group, the first generation, but also in terms of the second generation, they're very much focused on the Turkish community in the Netherlands when it comes to their leisure times. It's of course less in labor, when they work and so on, but when they have free time and can choose where to go and who to meet, you see that especially the Turkish group is very much in-group oriented, what they call very much focused on their own community. According to a lot of people, this has advantages, but for other people, this also raises some problems. The problem that people raise is that perhaps you get something like parallel societies, where you have Dutch people living together and then Turkish people living together, and rather than a society which is more integrated. So this is another statistics which people find problematic. A last thing that I would like to point out, perceptions of discrimination, which are quite high for all these groups. I made a distinction here between group and personally. That means people have been asked, are Turkish people in the Netherlands ever been discriminated? And they're also asked, are you, as an individual, ever been discriminated? What you normally always find that this is much higher than that. But if you look at that group level, are Turkish people discriminated in the Netherlands, then you see that almost 3 out of 4 say yes, certainly. And the same is for the Moroccan, the Surinamese is a little bit lower, and Antilleans also. So there is a very high percentage of immigrants that have the idea, rightly or wrongly, that members of their group are often discriminated. Personal is a little bit less, but still it's quite high. I would say that 41% says that they personally face discrimination in all kinds of situations. I mean, there are much more of this kind of research, and you can, of course, specify the context. Do you experience it in your neighborhood, or do you experience it at your work, and so on and so on. But the overall picture is that it's relatively high that people experience this. And this is, of course, very important, because we know that experiences of discrimination, exclusion, negatively affect people in all kinds of ways. And I will talk about a little bit about that later. So this is a bit to give you an idea about what the situation in the Netherlands is, what kind of groups there are, what their position is, and in different ways whether they have a problematic situation or not. I hope this is more or less clear. Are there questions on this, or some additional things that you want to know about the situation? No? So, how do the Dutch, the native Dutch, view these people? Well, around the recent representative studies in the Netherlands, we do many, many studies. I mean, we have a social cultural planning office who does annual representative surveys. We survey everything. We want to know everything. So there are so many statistics that's unbelievable. One of the reasons why is that almost half of the Dutch think that there are much too many foreigners in the Netherlands. 40% think that the immigrants are a real threat to Dutch identity and culture. And around 40% does not like to have immigrants as a neighbor. And that's particularly true when they talk about Moroccans and Turks. They don't want to have them as neighbors. If you ask them whether they want to have people of these immigrant groups as members of their family, then the percentages are even much higher. I mean, then it goes up to something like 80. They don't want that simply. So, there is a lot of research about how the native Dutch see all these groups. And what they always find is a sort of ethnic hierarchy. An ethnic hierarchy in terms of the social distance that people want to keep towards the group. If you take this one, Dutch people, well, they prefer, most of all, they prefer to have contact with Dutch, right? People of their own group. And then they prefer to have contact with people from Southern Europe, Greek, Italian, Spaniards. We had also some immigrants of these countries. And then they say, well, okay, Surinamese, okay, that's the next one. Italian, that's the next one. And Turks and Moroccans are always at the bottom of that hierarchy. So what people say to have contacts, well, Southern Europeans, but Turks and Moroccans, no. Preferably not. So they're typically at the bottom of the hierarchy. This hierarchy is very interesting because it's a sort of rank ordering that people make in terms of the social distance that they want to keep towards these different groups. This is also interesting because if you ask people who are very prejudiced or people who are not prejudiced, they have the same rank ordering. I mean, non-prejudiced people are more accepting, but they still have that rank ordering. They are the least accepting towards Turks and Moroccans. In general, they accept everybody more, but Turks and Moroccans a little bit less. So that rank ordering is a sort of shared representation in society. Which groups are okay to have contacts with and which groups are not very okay to have contacts with. So it is very clear. By the way, such an ethnic hierarchy is also found in other countries. Then you have different groups, of course, but apparently in all countries there's a sort of hierarchy of groups that you should have contacts with and groups that's not so very nice to have contacts with. In France, for instance, the Algerians are at the bottom, right? And other groups are more accepted. Well, in Russia, you have the similar things. Well, in America, you also had that where African Americans are at the bottom. Asian Americans is more okay. So you see in all these countries, you have a sort of hierarchy. Probably there's also a hierarchy here in Turkey. You could also ask the Turkish people themselves, of course, who they like to have contact with and who they like to keep a distance to. Well, they like to have the most contacts, of course, with the Turks, members of their own group, if you say. And then they like to have the most contacts with Dutch people, right? And then you see they follow Surinamese, South European, Surinamese, Moroccan, and Italians. Moroccans, perhaps you would argue, they would like to have more contacts with Moroccans because there's also a Muslim group. But that's not true. It's also not true for the Moroccans. They also put the Turks way down below. So although these are the two major Muslim groups in the Netherlands, they still want to keep a distance towards each other. So this gives you an impression about how the different groups perceive each other in society, and of course especially also how the Dutch perceive these different groups in society. Yep. Sure.
What's the reason behind why these two groups, Moroccans and the Turks,
These two?
they're putting each other as a social distance?
Yeah.
What's the reason behind it?
There are probably different reasons. The reason for Turks to put the Moroccans a bit far behind is that they have different arguments if you talk to them. First of all, Moroccans are, well, a little bit North African, Arabian-speaking people. They're not like us modern Turkish people. And another important reason is that the Moroccans are considered in the Netherlands the most problematic group in terms of crime, in terms of all kind of issues, and the Turks do not want to be associated with that. So the association, which is often made also by politicians, Moroccans are a problem. That means Islam is a problem, so all Muslims are a problem. And Turks want to say, whoa, wait. We're not like those Moroccans. I mean, I don't want to be associated with that. So they really want to make a distinction between themselves and Moroccans. They say this is something different, right? The position for the Moroccans towards the Turks, that's less clear why that would be the case. That's less clear. I'm not sure about that, why they put the Turks relatively low in this hierarchy. For the Turks, it's quite clear why they do that. They don't want to be associated with these negative Moroccans. Well, why do the Dutch, this is for the native Dutch, have these negative attitudes? Well, there are so many studies in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is doing study after study, all kind of stuff. And what you find, well, the usual thing, gender differences, males are more negative than females towards immigrants. Age, older people are more negative than younger people. Well, all these sociological studies, the lower educated are more negative. People living in less urban situations are more negative. But are also interesting because in the Netherlands we always collect annual almost data. You can see whether there are effects on the prejudice related to developments in society. When unemployment goes up in society, then you see that people become more negative towards immigrants, for instance. When there is more immigration coming in, people also start to become more negative, the usual thing. When there is more media attention, quite interesting because all this multi-level kind of research, they take all these things into control and then they still find an effect for this. The more the media talk about problematic relationships of immigrants, the more negative people become because they pick up these negative messages and then you see that they report negative feelings. So this kind of research is done a lot in the Netherlands where you try to monitor who exactly in society is more or less negative towards immigrants. Of course, this is very interesting and useful, especially for policymakers. But the problem with this kind of research is that you do not really know what's behind it. Let's take education. Why is it that higher educated are less negative? What exactly is going on there? Have they learned to think more sophisticated or in a more nuanced way? Or are they in a position that they feel less threatened by minority members or immigrants and so on? So there could be all kind of processes behind that association between education and prejudice. So there's also people who try to look into that. Our research is more, I would say, into that. What is behind these big associations? Now, probably you have heard about this, but certainly since the beginning of 2001, there has been a major shift in debates in Western Europe, but in other countries also. I mean, we're not talking about immigrants nowadays, we only talk about Islam. The problem is Islam, that is the bright boundary, like they call it. Muslims are singled out, they are the prototypical outsiders. Islam is presented as being incompatible with Western norms and values, and so on. So the whole debate has shifted from immigrants to Muslims. And everything is about the problems that Muslims now would give in society. Well, also here's some statistics to give you an idea about this. The Pew Global Attitude Project, that's a worldwide project done in the United States on all kinds of countries. And in 2005, they did a big research on anti-Muslim feelings in the world. And in the Netherlands came out that 1 in 2, 50% was explicitly negative about Muslims, one of the highest in different Western European countries. So there was also a little subtle prejudice. People do not hide it. They say, well, I do not think it's very nice, but they explicitly say, I don't want it. I don't like it. I have really negative feelings towards Muslims. So also in the Netherlands, in 2005, they found the same thing, that 1 in 2 considers Western and Muslim ways of life as opposites, things that do not go together. It's impossible to really reconcile these things. And when you ask further, it always goes about these issues It has something to do why the Dutch are negative, because they think, well, in Islam, gender equality is not like it is in our society. So that makes it almost impossible to have both. Issues of sexuality are always mentioned, especially in the Dutch case. They talk about homosexuality and the freedom to do that, whereas in Islam it wouldn't be allowed, and so on and so on. Also female sexuality, and all kind of freedoms that will be typical for the Netherlands and not possible in Islam. And for people, therefore, the things that really define Dutch identity, the Dutch nation, gender equality, homosexuality, sexual freedoms, and so on, would be difficult to reconcile with ideas, values within Islam. Yeah?
When they say Islam, they're making kind of a generalization about your understanding of Islamic culture, right? They're not like asking the participant to think specifically about an Islamic country or like, or your Muslim friends. They're just your general understanding of Islamic civilization or culture in general, right?
They don't have an understanding of Islam at all, actually. They just use it as a sort of label, and they don't know that there are different ways to be a Muslim and so on. I mean, they do not really care. They talk Western culture, Western values, and Islam. I mean, also Western values. I mean, don't forget these issues like gender equality, sexuality, freedoms, or euthanasia, or something like that. There are all kind of groups, Dutch groups, who are against these. Right? Religious Dutch people, Christian people who do not support this at all, but they are, of course, a minority. So they'll always be presented as typical Western values, but that's not shared by everybody at all. So there's also a sort of label, Western values against Islam, but of course, politicians do that in that way, but of course, in reality, people don't think about it. Yeah. Well, to delve a little bit deeper in this, also on Dutch adolescents, we found that 1 in 2 is very negative, explicitly negative about Muslims, and they are intolerant towards Muslims. So we did also some studies on that, like other people. Why? Not only that incompatibility between values, but it's probably also, can you dig it a little bit deeper to understand what exactly is it that people make so negative about Muslims, especially among adolescents? Why would that be? Now, you can look at that in different ways. I will give you one example. Don't be scared about this schema. It's the end result of a large study. The way you read this thing is very simple. You start with what we try to understand, what we try to explain, prejudice towards Muslims in the Netherlands, right? And then you have certain things which could predict that, could be related to that. And what we have here is a sort of 3 types of threat that people can experience, right? So what's said here, that people's symbolic threat is you feel that our culture, our Dutch culture, our identity is threatened by Muslims, right? Well, the more you feel that, the more prejudiced you are. So threat is a sort of causal thing for prejudice that people have. That means here the plus sign means there is a significant relationship between these two. The more threatened you feel that our culture is undermined, the more negative you become toward Muslims. There's also a realistic threat, material threat. They are taking away our jobs, right? That kind of thing. Or they're violent, right? They're dangerous. The association terrorism, Islam is also often made. So the more you think that, believe that, the more negative you come towards Muslims. And there's also these are really negative essences, since these are really nasty people, right? Muslims are really nasty people. You can't trust them, and that kind of ideas that people hear in the media. Well, the more you have that, also, the higher the prejudice is. So actually what you see, there are different forms of threat. All kind of research where you examine prejudice, normally what you find is that threats are one of the main causes, the main drivers why people react negatively to all kinds of groups. This is not specific for this study in prejudice towards Muslims. If you do studies in other countries about prejudice, then you always find that the threat feelings are a major impetus in why people become very negative. Well, the model further, so these are very closely connected to prejudice. Yeah?
The relationship between realistic threat and prejudice, that's negative?
No, this is this one here. This one I forgot, sorry. No, this should be here. Okay. So these are the threats which are very close to prejudice. You could also ask, what explains these threats? Why are some people more threatened than others, right? So one thing is, for instance, here, the more people feel that their Dutch identity is important, I'm Dutch and that's important for me, the more that they feel that their Dutch identity is undermined, is threatened, right? For people who do not care very much about their Dutch identity, they don't have the idea that Muslims undermine our cultural identity. I don't care, actually, to be Dutch. It's not important for me, so what's the big deal? But for people who do really care about their national identity, they have the idea that they're really threatening our identity, our culture. So this is sort of factor which explains why people experience more threat and then become more negative towards Muslims. You see also factors who works against it. Prejudice, contact. The more people have contact with Muslims, the less they think there is a sort of negative image of Muslims. They know Muslim people, so they know that they're not nasty people. I mean, so contact works against these negative ideas. It works also positive to that. The more contact you have, the more positive you are in general towards people of this particular group. Multiculturalism is another thing. The more you endorse the idea that the Netherlands should be a diverse society, that that's a good thing, that's an inevitable thing, that's a worthwhile thing, you see, the more people endorse that, the less threat they experience. This is all the negative signs, right? Just the more you feel that, the less threatening it is, that diversity. I mean, you embrace it, you think it's a good idea. So it's not a problem that there are people from different groups living in the Netherlands. There's also some direct effect here. Well, this is just one example. There are many, many studies trying to understand what exactly is now behind these negative feelings, apart from gender and education and so on. But psychologically, when do people feel threatened? Where does that come from? And is that related to negative things? The hope, of course, is if you do this kind of research, that you can find ways to improve it, to try to overcome it. Yes, this was only one example. I could give many more. But there is a lot of studies on why the Dutch are negative or not towards all kinds of immigrant groups, and especially now Muslims. Okay. Well, how do Muslims themselves react to this situation? I told you that they experience or see a lot of discrimination, and they know that in all kinds of situations they are being evaluated quite negatively. Now, how does that relate to how they see themselves and whether they feel a sort of sense of commitment to the nation that they live in? Well, this is a very central issue now. Probably you haven't heard it here, but in Western Europe, Angela Merkel has argued that the greatest problem of immigrants is that they do not feel a sense of connection to Germany. Cameron in Great Britain have argued exactly the same. Multiculturalism is a problem because these immigrants do not feel a sense of loyalty to the country where they live. So we can only have a culturally diverse society if they also feel a sort of sense of belonging, a sense of national identification. So this is very important nowadays. They talk about divided loyalties that these immigrants would have, right? And that's the problem. So you can't have a cohesive society. You can't trust people that. So you really need that. And people have been arguing this from an assimilation perspective, saying actually, well, these immigrants should become like us. They should forget their culture and identity, but fully assimilate, become Dutch like us. But it's also been argued by people who are in favor of multiculturalism, right? Especially in Britain, there are important people who have made an argument, also a philosophical argument, for why multiculturalism is good. But they always stress that multiculturalism can only work when at the same time there is a sense of collective belonging, that everybody has the idea we belong to one nation, a diverse nation, but one nation. So multiculturalism can only work if there is that sense of national belonging. The famous examples that are always being given, Canada would be one of the most successful multicultural societies. There is cultural diversity, but cultural diversity is intrinsic to how Canada is defined, how they see itself as a nation. So also multiculturalists argue that this is a very important topic. When and why do immigrants develop a sort of sense of belonging, a sense of commitment to the host nation? That's important for the cohesion and the development of the nation. Now, is there reason to concern for this? Yes. It depends on how you see it. Again, there is quite some research on that. There are large-scale cross-national research. This research by Elkins is about, if I remember correctly, more than 50 countries in the world. And they did it on the World Value Survey research. And what they found, there is indeed a quite significant gap in the sense that the attachment, the national identity, the sense of belonging of majorities is much higher than minority groups. That's in all countries the case, right? And so also another research, a recent research, shows very clearly that the sense of belonging, the sense of national identity is lower on minority groups, immigrant groups, all kinds of minority groups than the majority. So there seems something going on there in the sense that it could be problematic. Now, you can look at this in different ways. We have tried to look at it in terms of, well, what kind of conditions, what kind of determinants are there? When do immigrants feel a stronger sense of national belonging, right? And to what extent is it possible to feel both? To feel a member of your ethnic minority group and a member of the host nation. So can you feel Turkish Dutch? Is that possible? To what extent do people that? I feel Turkish and Dutch. And can you also, is it also possible to feel a Muslim and Dutch at the same time? Do people are able to combine these things, or are they also for immigrants themselves contradictory? Is it possible that or not? So these are two questions that we try to assess or address in a lot of research that we have been doing. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. First, what has research found in terms of who and when do people have a sense of national belonging? I'm talking here about the situation in the Netherlands. So when do immigrants feel that they identify with the nation? Well, there are a couple of things which are important. Having citizenship makes a difference. So in the Netherlands, you can have dual citizenship. So a lot of Turkish people have dual citizenship or have Dutch citizenship. That's also possible. But there are also people who have only Turkish citizenship. If you compare that, then you see that people who have a dual or a Dutch citizenship feel more Dutch, feel more belonging to the nation than people who have only a Turkish citizenship. The same is true for other groups, by the way. Being of a later generation. So in general, you see that second-generation immigrants have a stronger sense of belonging than first generation, which is quite logical, I would say. The longer you live in a country makes a difference. Higher education makes a difference. So more higher educated immigrants also feel a stronger sense of belonging. Better labor market position. Language. If you're able to speak Dutch, then people also start to feel more Dutch, simply said. Well, these are all quite... And more contacts. If you have more contacts with Dutch people, then you also gradually start to feel more Dutch. So these are, again, sociological work that tries to examine which kind of factors are now related to that sense of belonging. You can again put it in a sort of model. What you then find normally is that these kind of things, those length of residence, labor market, second generation, they have an influence on these kind of things. You better learn to speak Dutch, you have more contacts, more friendship with Dutch, and on the basis of that, you feel more that you belong, right? You feel more that you also belong to this particular nation. So this is the more important things which are closer to this sense of belonging than these kind of sociological indicators. They do not really give an explanation of why this would be. Well, again, these are many, many studies about these kind of factors, and papers are being written about when and why and which groups have a stronger national identification than others. Well, I also want to come back on discrimination. because you can imagine that discrimination is also very important. When people feel discriminated, it's probably very difficult to develop a sense of national belonging. Why should I develop a sense of national belonging when they don't want me? That's very difficult to do. You feel excluded, so probably you will turn your back to society and go back to your own ethnic group, your Turkish community, because there you find support and acceptance rather than those people who discriminate you. Why would you have a sort of sense of belonging with them? So we did a lot of research on how could discrimination work in this whole process. That's what I talked about. I will give an example of the discrimination. Another thing that we were wondering about is people are not only facing discrimination by the majority group, they're also facing pressures within their own community. Pressure of not to become too Dutch. Pressure not to assimilate too much. Pressure to maintain the original Turkish culture. Pressure to maintain the Muslim belief, and so on. So there is not only a treatment by the outside world, but it's probably also something like that, which makes it very difficult to also feel a sense of belonging to Dutch society. The stronger you feel that in-group pressure of your own community. A third thing that we looked at, when is it possible to combine your ethnic and your national identification, depends probably of whether you find the values between both compatible or not. I mean, what it means to be Turkish and what it means to be Dutch. If you think, well, these are so different things that I can't really combine, that could be also important. And the last thing is what I will talk about is monolithical identities. What happens when ethnic and religious identity come very close together? Because then it's even more problematic to develop a sense of national belonging. Well, I will tell you a little bit very briefly on all four, the importance of all four. Well, the first one is discrimination. And what you find normally there, a lot of studies, they talk about the rejection disidentification model. What actually means what I said earlier. When people feel discriminated, what they start to do is they turn towards their own group. When these majority members do not want me, then you turn to your own community where you find support and so on. So normally, the higher people perceive discrimination, the stronger they start to identify with their own community. Right? And when they do that, they find it much more difficult to also develop a sense of national belonging. Right? So there is a sort of process going on. Discrimination leads that you turn your back to society, feel more connected to your ethnic minority group, and at the same time take a distance to society as a whole. National identification becomes lower. So this is a sort of model which could, very simple model, which could explain what happens when people face discrimination. But there are many examples of this. Again, don't be scared of this simple, this is just a result of research. And simply what it shows is what I just argued. When people feel, Turkish people feel that Turks are discriminated, they start to identify stronger as Turks, right? And when they do that, you have a negative, it becomes more difficult to also feel Dutch. That becomes very difficult. And what you do here is to see if this is really in between this relationship. Normally you see discrimination, I don't feel Dutch at all. How does that come? Well, it's because you feel more Turkish, and then it becomes impossible to feel Dutch. So a sort of mediating process, if you like. So this is one example. There are many more examples where you see that discrimination has a negative effect on that host national identification. In-group pressure, that second point. So in your own community, you can have the same idea. So there is pressure to maintain your ethnic identity, to show ethnic loyalty, right? Do not be a traitor to your own community, that kind of thing. So keep your authentic Turkish identity, not Dutchify. In Dutch we talk niet vernederlandsen. That means do not become too Dutch in the things you do, the way you think, the things you express. Now, the stronger that pressure is there, well, the stronger your ethnic identification becomes, because they want you to keep your Turkish identity. And then if you do that, the stronger that is, the more negative this again becomes, because this becomes very difficult to do. Now again, don't be scared. But this is simply the same thing, but now combined. So you see that where comes this Turkish ethno-religious group identification from? Well, there is one, discrimination. The more discrimination, the stronger this. And there is these in-group norms, pressure. The more you find this, also the more important your Turkish identity becomes. And when this becomes more important, due to that, then this is much more difficult. This study was done in Germany and in the Netherlands, and you find in both countries exactly the same. Right? So you see that there are two important determinants of how strongly you feel about your ethnic religious group, make it more difficult to also feel a member of the host nation. The third one, so I talked about discrimination and I talked about in-group pressures. You could imagine that it is very difficult to combine your ethnic and national identity when you see that there is a sort of incompatibility between the two. The values that define your Turkish identity and those that define the Dutch identity, you think, yeah, you can't have both. So I have to make a choice here, right? So some people see there is really an incompatibility, contradiction between the two. Other people say, no, there's not an incompatibility at all. Why? You can combine them. So this is probably very important, how people perceive these incompatibilities between values. Now, here we have a group who does not see incompatibility. This is a group of people who argue, well, of course I can be Turkish and I can be Dutch. There's no problem there. Now, for that group, you see that there is not a significant, this negative but not a significant association. So they feel Turkish and they feel Dutch. It's not contradictory for them, right? Whereas people who do find values, Dutch values and Turkish values as contradictory, then you see that you get a very negative thing. Then it becomes impossible to be both. How can I be a Turkish Muslim and at the same time a Dutch, when Turkish Muslim means something completely in the opposite to what it means to be Dutch? I can't do that. So for those people, it's very problematic to have a combination of the two. It's also interesting, by the way, this, you see for both those people who see a sort of value incompatibility, that there is a very strong relationship. There should be incompatibility, sorry. There's a very strong relationship between these two. They see that discrimination then leads to turning your back. If that's not the case, then just try harder that they will accept you. That's also a possibility in your reaction to discrimination. Yeah?
Positive support and discrimination are different frequency things. Like maybe you're discriminated once a month, but you're positively reinforced for meeting the norms of your group maybe every day. Does that make a difference? Like you'll remember that discrimination experience very negatively, but still, I mean, are they the same affective, emotional processes?
No, probably not. No, no. Yeah, discrimination. I just put here one label, but you can, of course, examine that in all kind of ways. Like I said earlier, you can see in different situations. Do people experience it? Who is discriminating you can also be very important in how you react. Are there authority figures or not? Is it in everyday life or not? Is there real incidents which are very important or not? But actually, for the in-group norms, that's a bit different, but sometimes it's also applicable to that. I mean, sometimes it's really that people say, oh, what you're doing is not correct. I mean, people really express these norms in a very clear way. In other situations, they do not do that. It's more, you assume that it's not allowed or accepted within your community to think certain things. But at least you see that both pressures are important. What the majority group says and what your own community says about this. I hope you're still with me. I'm not sure. But the last one that I want to talk about is monolithical identities. This is the question, what happens when people, I'm still talking about when do people develop a sense of Dutchness, when they have a sense of belonging to the nation. But what happens when two identities come very closely together? So actually what is meant here is what happens when being Turkish means being Muslim and the other way around. So when your ethnic and religious identity are more or less intertwined, very closely connected, so that you have a very strong identity, if you like. There are people who say, well, it's very important for me to be Turkish, Muslim is less, and the other way around, right? So for these people, they would have a sort of complex, right? Complex identity. It's called, well, they have this, and in another things, they are also that. A simple identity structure would mean that the one defines the other, right? It also means that the people you know in your ethnic community are the same people you know in your religious community. These are just the same people. It's the way you live your life. It's ethnic and religious is the same. So then it becomes a very strong identity. It is argued. The identity structure becomes very strong. So here I try to explain it a little bit different. Individuals differ in that. So an inclusive or complex identity implies that there is a weak association between being Turkish and being Muslim. A simplified is that there is a very strong connection between the two. Now, literature suggests when there is a very simplified structure, then people are less tolerant toward others. It's when people have a more complex structure about thinking about themselves that they're more able to be open to others. Now, we did it in several studies to examine that, but to give you one idea where you find that, you ask people, is it necessary for a person of my ethnicity to also be a Muslim? So what do you think? Is it necessary for a Turkish person to be also a Muslim, if you ask it in the Netherlands? The more people think yes, the less they identify with the Netherlands, the less open they also are towards other groups. I just put this here, but you can also look at the other things. So the more closely these two are connected, the less open people can be to other groups and to society in general. Here I have another example of another study. This line is about people who feel very strong about their Muslim identity, and also people who have a very high ethnic. So there's people who say, yes, being Turkish is very important, and that's the same for me as being a Muslim. Well, these people this is a scale for national identification. These are the lowest on feeling Dutch. So people who say, my ethnic, my Turkish, and my Muslim are one and the same thing for me. For them, it's very difficult to also develop a sense of belonging to Dutch society compared to these other groups. So there you see, when these two identities come together, more monolithical, if you like, it becomes very difficult to open yourself up to the society you live in. I'm not hearing it.
I'm saying that so the source of the problem is a problem of So you mean the problem of these here, just now you are talking, people cannot, what do you say, Turkish people, they cannot adopt this Dutch culture just because they feel so Muslim. Is this because of that?
No, it is when they have both. When feeling Turkish and feeling Muslim is for them the same thing. It's connected. It's closely connected. So they can't make a distinction between feeling Turkish and feeling Muslim. It's not two independent dimensions. It's something which is so very closely connected. So for them, it's very difficult then to open up to Dutch society.
So I'm asking you, what is the exact point here? I mean, is this Islam? Because if you don't feel too much Muslim as a Turkish, so it's not going to be a problem for you to adopt this new culture.
Yeah, that's what that shows.
Yeah, it shows that. So it means the variable as Islam is a variable, the problem.
No, because also the other way around. When you feel strong about a Muslim but not very strong about Turkish, then you can also more easily adapt. That's exactly what it shows here. It's only when both are very high and strongly connected.
Is this the case for the other, like Moroccans? Is this the case? So
the Moroccans, you get the same.
And one more question, it's going to be last. Is this only for Muslims, Muslim ethnic groups in Dutch, in Netherlands, Muslim, and they are Muslim and they are coming from different countries like Moroccans and Turks? What about other religions and other ethnic groups? Do they have the same problem?
I don't know that. I've never done research on that. The only thing that I know that this research on what they call identity complexity, that's started in the US, in the United States, and it's also been done, for instance, in Northern Ireland, where you have the same thing. You have Catholics and Protestants and British and Irish, and there you have the same thing. For people where these two come together, being Irish and being Catholic, both, they're very negative. And being British and being Protestant, where they come together, being very negative. So also there you see, when you have what they call a monolithical identity, something which is very strongly connected with the two, then you become less tolerant and less open to others. In the US, they have done similar studies on other types of groups, but they come up with the same results. So in that sense, you could say there is some general process going on. Whether that's true for all groups, I don't know. I mean, you could examine that. I don't know, for instance, the Surinamese in the Netherlands, they have more a Christian background. So I don't know how it would happen there. Yeah? Well, this was just another example. So we have different studies, because exactly for these kind of questions, do you know this for sure? So you do 1 and 2 and 3 studies to make sure with different groups that the thing that you find is that really convincing? Do you really find it again and again and again? So is there something in it that could explain when and why people have a sense of commitment to the nation in this case or not? But you can do this in the same way in terms if you ask what they think about other groups. So if you would ask Turkish Muslims what they think about Moroccans or Surinamese, then you also find that the stronger these two identities are connected, the more negative they are towards Moroccans and Surinamese and Antilleans and so on. So that also suggests that such a simplified identity structure goes together with less tolerance towards others, simply said. Okay. To give one additional example, you could, of course, imagine I've been talking about Muslims and Turks, and implicitly I've been talking about Sunni Muslims in the Netherlands. Most Turkish people in the Netherlands are Sunni Muslims. But there are also some 20,000 to 30,000 Alevi Muslims living in the Netherlands. And you see that they have a different situation. What's the difference here? Well, here is the group who has a high Muslim identification from the Sunni and a high from this, right? So for this group, the association between ethnic identification and national is negative. So that means Turkish Muslims who feel very strong about their Turkish identity and very strong about their Muslim identity, they keep a distance to society, right? Whereas Turkish people who identify strong with their Turkish identity but do not have a very strong Muslim identity, they do not have that distance to society. That's a positive. They can have both. For the Alevi, it's different. The difference is here. So Alevi who have a strong Turkish identity and at the same time feel very strong about their Alevi identity, right? For them, it's no problem to combine both, because their interpretation of what it means to be a Muslim by Alevi is different. For them, it's not a problem. It's not incompatible to be a Muslim in an Alevi sense and to be a Dutch national. Many of them argue even that's the same. I mean, the humanistic kind of interpretations that there is and so on. So you see, it also depends on the interpretation that you have about what it means to be a Muslim. It's not only about the strength of feeling a member of a particular group, which is, of course, quite interesting and important. Now, to end, I mean, this has been a story about the Dutch national context. Some of the things I talked about we also did it in Germany, and there is, of course, more research on this, but it's, of course, important to see. I also only talked about how strong people feel a sort of sense of national belonging. But of course you can look at all kind of other things which are very interesting. What do the immigrants think about the national politics or the authorities in the Netherlands or national institutions, Dutch institutions, or the national history in the Netherlands? How do they view all these aspects of Dutch national identity? I haven't been talking about that, and there is not much research about that also. This is, of course, I hope that it's been clear that both that ethnic and religious dimension is very important to understand. And the last thing, I haven't talked about this, of course. I just talked about a couple of studies who try to measure all kind of identities and so on. But in everyday life, people are, of course, constantly talking about what it means to be this and what it means to be that. And they're what they would call, they're performing their identities and so on. So there's a whole field of research which is very important. How people in their everyday life do their Turkishness or their Muslimness or their Dutchness and so on. And in what way they show it and so on. So that's a very important line of all kind of research that we also are involved in, but which I didn't talk about here. I can't do everything. I hope this is more or less clear. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one question. How did the murder of the film director Theo van Gogh, how did this affect the opinions of the Dutch people against the Muslims? Because this was a big thing in the media, and also a guy who was called the Geert Wilders, who also appeared like for now 10 years or something like this. So how does these things affected the opinions of Dutch people against Muslims? Wow. And also because I have also relatives in the Netherlands. Like earlier they were not really speaking about discriminations, but in the last years, so I think they are more discussing about this, about the discrimination things and so on.
No, I fully agree. I said somewhere since 2001 it changed, since the 9/11 actually, but certainly what happened in the Netherlands with Theo van Gogh only fueled that whole idea, and it became more and more negative. And I also know from friends that feeling excluded and discrimination has only increased since then. Yeah, people here in the media, people say the most negative things what you could imagine about Muslims and about immigrants. What you would say, what? It was unimaginable 10 years ago, but now people can say anything they like, and they say the most horrific things in talk show and on television, and nobody. But of course, if it affects you, they talk about you as an immigrant or a Muslim. So it affects those people very much. I mean, yeah, it's really a problem. They talk about now, the Dutch society becomes more and more polarized. Yeah, of course, it becomes more and more polarized by the way the debate is being conducted at this moment. So I fully agree, it has a very negative impact. And there are also figures now that show that especially higher educated people of Turkish background and Moroccan background think about returning, because especially they argue, well, after all that I've done, get a good education, learn the language, I still have the feeling that I'm a second-class citizen. I don't take it anymore. So the lower-class people say, okay, especially the well-educated, university-educated Turkish people are now saying, well, this can't be true anymore. I've invested so much in this country to make it here. Well, I make my contribution, and I still feel that they don't really want me. Yeah, in Germany it's the same story. So whether they actually will go to Turkey, that's another thing. But at least they're talking about it and considering. It's also to do, of course, that the economy in Turkey is improving, so that also perhaps gives them opportunities here. But they especially talk about that situation, that they feel excluded, although they do good in all kinds of situations, in educational sense, in language sense, and so on.
I have a problem. I have a question relating to the European Union process, how the Dutch people takes care relating in those issues. I mean, as a macro sociological understanding of that. I mean, how do Dutch people accommodate the European Union within all these contexts? I mean, you explain, because while you are speaking about the divided loyalties, on the other hand, if you put it like a more positive, divided loyalties, somehow the negative connotation let's change the word or discourse like plural loyalties,
Sure.
overlapping authorities, plural loyalties. How those things that affect all these perceptions or policies of those people.
So a divided loyalty was not a term by me, but it's a term that's been used by politicians. So yeah, plural loyalty is, of course, an interesting term. I think, I'm not fully sure whether you mean that, but the way people see the European Union now, they are becoming more and more skeptic. Or for different reasons. One of the reasons is, of course, the crisis in Greece, that everybody thinks we have to pay for that in the Netherlands and Germany, so we don't want that anymore. But also, if it's related to, for instance, the possible entry of Turkey in the European Union, you see that more and more people are saying, no, we shouldn't do that. For all kinds of reasons, they say that. But one of the main reasons is also that they say, why should we include a Muslim country in the European Union? The European Union is based on, well, a Christian Judaist tradition. So that doesn't fit anymore. We can't have that. And right-wing politicians, of course, use that language. Geert Wilders, somebody was talking about, who was the right-wing political leader. He really stresses that. He's absolutely against Turkey entering the EU. He's also absolutely against making further contributions to Greece, for that matter, but still. They really stress the nationalistic card, so they don't want that. I think, yeah, the support for European Union is declining, I would say, in the Netherlands, yeah.
So your research demonstrates that the complexifying the identities diminish the potential for intergroup conflict. So are there any policies compatible to this finding in the Dutch context or other contexts?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of, no. No. Could be, but I don't know. What? Hope? Well, I got the impression, but I'm not sure, you have to be very careful, but I got the impression that the last year or something, the climate is a little bit changing, in the sense that the negative discourse about Muslim is a little less. I mean, I hear now people recently, major politicians of some parties saying, well, perhaps multiculturalism wasn't that bad after all. You haven't heard that for 10 years. They really said multiculturalism, diversity is a drama, is dead, is all wrong. But now you're very silent. You hear people say, yeah, but we are now factually a multicultural diversity. That's a fact. So it doesn't mean that we have to have a multicultural policy, but at least we should do something with that, accommodate it in one way or another. An additional reason for that is that demographers have predicted that we need immigrants in Germany, in the UK, and in the Netherlands. We need immigrants. Our population is aging and getting older and older, and we need more people, simply said. So they're talking about, yeah, actually, probably we will need more immigrants. We have now more immigrants from Eastern Europe, Poland and Bulgaria, but they think, yeah, we can't just afford to close our borders in a way. So we have to do something with that diversity which brings immigration, and not only talk about it in a negative way, but see a sort of way out of this in a more positive sense. And I'm not sure whether that really will continue. I don't know.
In terms of multiculturalism, and you said that a collective national belonging is trying to be, maybe constructed, and maybe this is nice. But I think that maybe not for the Netherlands context, but in other countries, there might be some problems between majority and minority related to the social memories between them, or sure. the way, it's written here, related to the national histories of two groups. Can't we create a different identification, not a national, collective national identification, but a different identification in a more cosmopolitan sense, Can we create something like that, or do you think it's a hopeless situation?
You want my personal opinion or my research? My personal opinion,
both, please.
My personal opinion would say no. I don't think this is a viable way. I think for many people, at least for the coming decades, the nation is and remains very important. So assuming that you can do without that, for a lot of people, that's the frame of reference that they have. And it's also with a lot of legal aspects to it and financial aspects to it. So a sense that you, as a nation, as a group, have to produce something and help each other, and as a country do something, I think that will still remain important. At the same time, it's true that, of course, there are, in all kind of ways, national borders are not longer very important. I mean, people travel and have information everywhere, so that's also going on. Yeah, I mean, sociologists have argued this for a long time. There's, on the one hand, globalization, but there's also regionalization, right? People do both. They become more open, but they also want to stick to their own situation. I think, yeah.
First, I would like to thank you for your speech. It was really nice to hear you here in Istanbul. In explaining the national identification of immigrants with the host country, what's the role of the country context? I mean, if a country is more immigrant-friendly or more welcoming to the foreigners, then the situation could be different, like in Canada. And how can we compare Canada and the Netherlands?
Yeah, I fully agree, Aisha. Well, she was a student of mine in Utrecht for 2 years in the research master. So, yeah, sure. I mean, the way the nation itself understands itself is very important for whether you are able to incorporate immigrants. I mean, in a lot of Western European countries, the idea is there is an indigenous majority group, the Dutch or the Germans. I mean, they have lived there forever, and they have built that society. And now these newcomers come in, right? In Canada, it's different. We're all immigrants, right? So, yeah, there are new immigrants. So that's a different situation. We have to cope with that. We have learned to do that because we're all immigrant groups, and together we form this diverse nation. In many European countries, that's not the case. There is an indigenous majority who actually claims and argues that they are the original inhabitants and have more rights, basically, on the basis of that already. So for immigrants, it's much more difficult to feel included. In the Netherlands, for instance, you can't make a distinction, I understood it's in Turkey also difficult, but between ethnic Dutch, for the Dutch, what their ethnicity would be and their nationality would be. That's the same. Dutch means, well, Dutch. That's the nation and that's the ethnic group. The same in Germany. So, yeah, if you talk about Dutch, you talk about us. So even if you talk about Dutch in a national sense, you still, the ethnic Dutch still think you talk about us. So it's very difficult to feel part of that, to feel included. Because there is a sort of implicitly, a sort of ethnic conception, if you like, right? Whereas if you would have a country with a more civic conception, which is open to citizenship to all kind of people from all kind of groups, then it's more easy also to feel included in that conception. So these kind of distinctions have been researched a lot, and that of course makes it quite a difference for feeling included for immigrants. So yeah, I agree.
I'm rather interested in resistance cultures. So I was wondering, I can't really get too much informed about what's going on in the Netherlands in terms of resistance and acts of resistance, especially after the last social movements taking place, arising from North Africa. So you also talked about hate speech being developed, especially after the cartoon crisis. Not back in 2001 only, but the cartoon crisis also had a huge impact, you've been saying. So I'm wondering whether there is, you know, a contrasting resistance movement taking place against that hate speech, or any impact of those social movements on the immigrants, or those groups that are rather, you know, pro-immigrant and sort of not counter-strike.
Yeah. No, that certainly is. But in the last, I think in the last 4 or 5 years, they lost the debate, basically. They are being branded as softies or as people from the loony left. That, well, yeah, that kind of terms are being used for people who say, well, wait. So, especially the right has won the debate until today, in the sense that they say, we dare to say what the problems are. We dare to say that it is a bad idea to have these immigrants in. And you, lefties, loony left, you are much too soft, right? You do not dare to take strict measures which are really necessary and so on. Well, that's the discourse. So I would say that the discourse now which dominates the debate is that right-wing discourse against immigration. But like I said already, in the last half a year, some people from the left are, and also from the right are arguing, perhaps we should be more open and more flexible in what we do. So yes, people are trying to do that, but are more or less branded as idiots, basically. If they would say something on telly, well, come on. A very good example, the Dutch Parliament had a special committee investigating the immigration and integration policies of the last 15 years in the Netherlands, from 1990 to 2005. So a special committee of the different political parties had an investigation on that. And the report came out in 2006 or 7, I forgot about that. And the main conclusion was, integration hasn't failed. Well, that only lasted for about an hour, and then everybody said, these are crazy people. I mean, forget about it, we can't even talk about it. So there was a parliamentary debate, and everybody said, yeah, well, this is silly. This is stupid work, not good, and so on and so on. And now you see that people, well, actually that report wasn't perhaps not so bad 6 years ago. But the first reaction then was, it was completely dominated. No, this can't be true. Idiots, this committee. They were colleagues, they were people in parliament. So that was the whole, and the media goes along with that. They say, yeah, no, it can't be true. Yeah.
There is an economic aspect to it, because what's happening in Spain, UK, and Greece consecutively also has an economic side to it. I mean, the youngsters can't do well and can't find employment. That's why they're out in the streets. But maybe the same isn't true for Netherlands. So not much is being done against hate speech, sort of thing. So
yeah,
could we say that, do you think?
You mean if the economic situation is bad, then people become more negative or more outspoken about the problems?
They're out in the streets, rather.
Yeah.
They start protesting harshly.
Yeah. I haven't seen that much in the Netherlands, to be honest, but I know, yeah, in other countries it could very well be. Of course, when the economic situation worsens, then people look for scapegoats. I mean, it's more easy to blame other groups that they take away this and take away that, or are too many of them are using social welfare and that kind of talk. You can hear that a lot, especially when it becomes problematic economically. So in this crisis, yeah. Although I must say that the current crisis, the last 2 years, you do not hear that much because it's very clear where the guilty ones are, right? It's the banks and that kind of stuff. So then you don't hear that story that much.
One more question. Well, you know, considering that political tendencies, talking about, is there any study in immigrants between, you know, perceived discrimination and immigrants' political views, like, for example, authoritarian tendencies or, you know, right-wing attitudes, etc., or, you know, the different one? Is there any relationship between these, or is there any studies related to this?
There are studies that show that the more people perceive discrimination, the more they think it's important to be political active as a group, as Muslims, for instance. Yeah, there are studies like that. And then be political active in an acceptable way, in a normal way. So not in terms of violence or something like that, but to raise your voice, to establish a political party. But this is, of course, this research is whether you have the intention to do that, right? Whether people actually will do that, that's more difficult. I mean, there have been attempts in the Netherlands to establish a Muslim party, political party, but that never really worked out. There have been some Muslim parties on a municipality level, but they also didn't really work out. But on a national level, you do not have that. You have, of course, Christian democratic parties and so on, but a Muslim party not. So.
Okay, thank you.
So a few of the things that you looked at were how compatible or not the ethnic identity was with the national identity, how much discrimination affected your own ethnic identity and how much your intra-group pressure affected your ethnic identity. But it seems that the discrimination could affect all of these things, right? If it's forcing me to identify more within my own ethnic group because I'm being discriminated against, that's going to put more pressure on other people in my group from me to identify more with that group. And by being discriminated against, that should also seem to make me think, oh, well, if I'm being discriminated against, maybe I'm not as compatible as I thought I would. So all those things seem to go sort of together. Have there been sort of causal analyses? There was one that you indicated between discrimination and your own ethnic identity, but have there been these other things looking at discrimination for compatibility and discrimination versus the...
Yeah, no, you're certainly right. I mean, you could argue the arrows work a little bit the other way around, or if you feel stronger with this, you perceive more discrimination. That could also happen and so on. So, yeah, the way you try to do this is indeed based on what you could call a survey, a cross-sectional survey. So you do not know real causal paths, then you would need more longitudinal kind of stuff or so. What you can do is, of course, test which model fits best the data that you have, right? You can do that. So that's always what we do. If you put this here, will that then also fit the data that you have, represent the data in a proper way or not? And actually what came out is that this is more or less statistically the best representation. But that doesn't say, of course, that there are not other possibilities. And of course, there are all kind of feedback loops and so on. I fully agree, sure, and that's very interesting and important. But to really put that in a research and disentangle that's something else. That's not that simple. I mean, to really show that empirically in this kind of work, yeah, that's difficult. So I think you're fully right.
So you mentioned the relationship between the media presentation and, what else was it?
And prejudice, probably?
Yes, thank you. So the media presentation and then prejudice. Has there been a time series analysis looking at which precedes what? Is it that there's more prejudice that's followed by more media, or is it that there's more in the media and then that's followed by more prejudice?
There has been causal longitudinal research on that, showing that the media actually affects people's view. Yes, certainly. So you could also say when people become more negative, the media pick it up and report it. But the media also definitely have their own impact on how people view things. People often do not know very much, so they take their information from what they read and hear. But again, there is also sort of, yeah,